Nathaniel Ashford said it once, in a boardroom, to 12 men who ran half the country's money. "My son will inherit everything I have built, and everything I have built will be secured the day he marries into the right family." He didn't shout it. He didn't have to. When Nathaniel Ashford spoke, rooms adjusted themselves around the words, the way furniture shifts when a wall moves. He was 61 years old. He had started with nothing, a storage unit in Trenton, New Jersey, a second-hand desk, and a mind that could see around corners that other men didn't even know existed. 40 years later, Ashford Capital was woven into the infrastructure of the country. Hospitals, ports, communications networks, transportation grids. If you lived in the United States and turned on a light switch or boarded a plane, somewhere in the invisible machinery behind that act, Nathaniel Ashford's fingerprints were on the wall. He had one son, Ethan. And Ethan was everything his father was not: quiet where Nathaniel was commanding, thoughtful where his father was decisive, built for patience in a family that had always moved at the speed of acquisition. Nathaniel loved his son the way a man loves the one thing he cannot fully understand. Fiercely. At a slight distance. Through the framework of plans. And the plan for Ethan was Victoria Langley. The Langleys were old money with a new appetite. Cornelius Langley had turned a fading railroad fortune into a technology empire over 30 years, and his daughter Victoria had grown up inside that empire the way other children grow up inside libraries, absorbing everything, curious about all of it, sharp in ways she didn't always let people see. She was 28. She had an MBA from Wharton and a laugh that could fill a room when she decided to use it. She was, by every external measure, the perfect match for an Ashford. Nathaniel had been working the alignment for 2 years. Dinners. Introductions. Quiet conversations with Cornelius over single malt in the study of one estate or another. The merger wasn't just personal. It was strategic. Langley's technology infrastructure and Ashford's capital networks, combined, would create something that hadn't existed before. A dynasty that didn't need anyone. The engagement announcement was set for the Ashford Foundation's annual gala, 600 guests, the kind of evening where the city's most powerful people told each other stories about their own importance while the cameras documented all of it. Nathaniel had written Ethan into every chapter of the plan. The timeline. The announcement. The ring, which had been selected by a jeweler who had dressed 3 first ladies. What he had not done, what it genuinely had not occurred to him to do, was ask Ethan what he wanted. Her name was Clara Reyes. She was 26 years old, and she had worked in the Ashford household for 3 years. Not as a housekeeper. That distinction mattered to the woman who hired her, Mrs. Paxton, the estate manager, who ran the Ashford house on Gramercy Park with the quiet authority of a general who happened to also know the thread count of every sheet in the linen closet. Clara's official title was residential coordinator, which meant she was the person who made sure the house ran the way a house of that size needed to run, without anyone who lived in it ever having to think about it. She ordered the groceries before they ran out. She knew which of the houseplants were dying before they showed it. She handled the scheduling for the household staff with a fairness that made people stay in jobs they might otherwise have left. She was the person the regular maintenance crews called when they had a question, and she was the person who knew, without being told, that Mr. Ashford took his coffee at 6:15 and could not be spoken to directly until 6:40. She was, in the language of that world, invisible. Competent and invisible, which was the highest compliment the people in that house knew how to pay. Clara did not come from money. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Allentown, Pennsylvania, the older of 2 daughters of a woman who had cleaned offices for 20 years without ever once complaining about it in front of her children. Her mother had a code: you do the work in front of you. You do it well. You don't apologize for where you started. Clara had carried that code into every room she'd ever walked into. She had a degree in hospitality management from Temple University. She had taken the Ashford job because it paid well and because Mrs. Paxton, who interviewed with the sharpness of a federal judge, had seen something in her that made the offer happen in 10 minutes instead of the usual 3 rounds. What Mrs. Paxton saw, and what Clara herself would have been embarrassed to name, was this: Clara Reyes could read a room the way other people read a sentence. Instantly. Completely. The emotional weather of a space landed on her before she'd fully crossed the threshold. Who was tense? Who was performing? What the silence between two people actually meant. It wasn't a gift she talked about. It was just the way she had always moved through the world. She had learned it, she thought, in her mother's apartment, where money was always thin and you learned early to read which kind of quiet meant everything is fine and which kind meant hold very still. In 3 years in the Ashford house, she had used it constantly and mentioned it never. She first noticed Ethan Ashford the way you notice a wrong note in a piece of music, not loud, just off. He was 29. He had his father's height and his mother's eyes, and he moved through his own family's house like a man trying not to take up too much space. He would come home from the office. He worked in a division of his father's company that handled international development partnerships, and go immediately to the library on the 2nd floor. He would be in there for hours. Clara had brought him tea without being asked to, twice, and both times he had looked genuinely startled, the way people look when they've forgotten they can be seen. He was polite in the way of someone who had been raised to be polite and had then, somewhere along the line, decided he actually meant it. She'd noticed 3 things about him, in the small ordinary ways you notice things about people you're paid not to notice. He always stopped at the kitchen on Sunday mornings and washed his own breakfast dishes. Every time. In a house with staff. He had a habit of reading 2 or 3 books at the same time, leaving them open and face down in different rooms, a kind of trail of interrupted thought. And whenever his father walked into a room where he already was, something in the set of his shoulders changed. Imperceptibly, if you weren't paying attention. But Clara was always paying attention. She knew what that shoulder shift meant. She'd seen it in other houses. It was the body's way of bracing. She didn't think about what it meant. She filed it away the way she filed everything she noticed in that house, carefully, privately, and without judgment. The night of the gala arrived. Clara was not supposed to be there. She managed the house. Event staffing for the foundation's gala was handled by a separate agency, vetted and assigned months in advance. But the event coordinator had a family emergency at 4 o'clock the afternoon of the gala, and Mrs. Paxton, who trusted exactly 3 people in the world with anything important, called Clara at 4:15. "I need you on the floor tonight. You know the family. You know the room. I'll arrange credentials." Clara said yes because she always said yes to Mrs. Paxton, and because she understood, without it needing to be said, that in a house like this one, being useful was the only currency that didn't depreciate. She arrived at the Meridian Hotel at 6:30. She pinned her credentials to a plain black blazer and walked the room before the guests arrived, tables, service stations, the stage set up, the sight lines, the way she always walked a space she was about to be responsible for. She knew where the kitchen bottleneck would happen. She knew which table configuration would create a traffic problem near the bar. She made 2 quiet adjustments and then took her position near the Eastern Service corridor and became what she was always paid to become. Invisible. The guests arrived like weather, in waves, loud and beautiful and self-assured, everyone performing some version of their own importance for everyone else's benefit. 600 people in a ballroom, and Clara could feel the specific gravity of each cluster, the way certain people pulled others into their orbit and certain people were orbiting hard and trying not to show it. She spotted Nathaniel Ashford immediately. He entered the way he entered every room, unhurriedly, with the composure of a man who had decided a long time ago that he was never going to arrive looking like he'd been rushing. He shook hands. He smiled the Ashford smile, which was warm and real and gave you nothing. He was flanked by 2 board members and, a half step back, by a woman in a deep green gown whom Clara recognized as Margot Osei, his chief communications officer and the person most responsible for making the Ashford name look exactly as good as Nathaniel required it to look. Victoria Langley arrived 10 minutes later with her parents. She was dressed in ivory and she wore it the way women who have never had to think about what they wore always wear things, with a casual ease that cost more than most people's cars. And then there was Ethan. He came in with his father's group, which meant he stood to the side of it, present, correctly positioned, smiling at the right moments. But Clara, watching from the eastern corridor, saw the shoulder shift happen the moment Nathaniel leaned over to say something in his ear. She looked away. It wasn't her business. The announcement was scheduled for 9 o'clock. At 8:45, Nathaniel took the stage for introductory remarks with the ease of a man who had given 10,000 speeches and found all of them slightly beneath him but performed them anyway because it was what the occasion required. He spoke about the foundation. About legacy. About the kind of future you build not just with capital but with intention. Clara was moving a service cart near the back when Ethan stepped away from the Langley group. She noticed it because she noticed everything. He didn't go toward the bar. He didn't go toward the restrooms. He stood still for a moment in the middle of the floor, 600 people swirling around him, and he had the look of a man who has just made a decision that cannot be unmade. She had 1 second to wonder what it was. Then he started walking. Toward her. She actually looked behind her, the same instinct she had always had. Surely he means someone else, but there was only the service corridor and the linen cart and the wall. Ethan Ashford walked across the entire length of that ballroom. Past the Langley table. Past 2 senators and a celebrity she'd seen on the cover of 3 magazines. Past his own father's gaze, which she saw land on his son's trajectory and go very, very still. He stopped in front of Clara. He was not performing. That was the first thing she registered. There was no audience-facing quality to what was on his face. He looked the way people look when they have decided to tell the truth after a very long time of not telling it. "I need to say something," he said. Low enough that only she could hear him. "And I need to say it here, in front of all of them, so it can't be taken back later." Clara looked at him carefully. "Mr. Ashford." "Ethan." "Ethan." She said it once, cautiously. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done a year ago." He looked at her with a steadiness that cost him something. "I'm not marrying Victoria Langley. I can't. I'm in love with someone who has never once treated me like an asset in a ledger." He paused. "That's you, Clara. I know this is the worst possible way to say it, and I'm sorry for the way, but I'm not sorry for the saying." The room had begun to notice. 600 sets of eyes don't all turn at once, but they turn the way birds do, 1, then 3, then all of them, in a wave. And Nathaniel Ashford stepped down from the stage. What happened in the next 4 minutes reshaped the rest of all of their lives. Nathaniel covered the distance between the stage and the eastern corridor in exactly the way you'd expect a man like him to cover it, without raising his voice, without breaking stride, radiating a controlled fury that was more terrifying than shouting would have been. He stopped at his son's shoulder and spoke quietly enough that the 600 people straining to hear him could not quite make out the words. But Clara could, because she was close enough. "You will walk back to that table," Nathaniel said. "You will apologize to Victoria and her father. And we will discuss this privately, tonight, after the guests have gone." Ethan didn't move. "No." The word landed in the space between them like something dropped from a height. Nathaniel looked at Clara then, really looked at her, for possibly the first time in 3 years, and she saw exactly what was behind his eyes. Not cruelty. Something worse, in its way. Dismissal. The assessment of a man who had spent his whole life calculating value and had reached his verdict in half a second. She was a variable he had not accounted for. And variables you haven't accounted for are problems. "Young woman," he said, measured and terrible, "I don't know what you've said to my son or what you've made him believe, but I will tell you plainly, whatever this is ends here." Clara held his gaze. She had held harder ones than this in smaller rooms with higher stakes to her than a ballroom. "I haven't said anything, Mr. Ashford." "Then you'll have no objection to stepping back." "I object to the assumption," she said. Quietly. Evenly. "But I'm not here to make a scene." She looked at Ethan then, and what she said next, she said only for him, "Whatever you need to say, say it. I'll be here." What Ethan said, he said to the room. He turned to face it, not performing, not posturing, just a man standing still in the middle of 600 people and deciding to be exactly what he was. I'm not going to apologize for this evening, he said. Loud enough to carry. I've spent a long time being managed, and I understand why. My father built something extraordinary and he has a right to want it protected. But I am not a merger strategy. And I am not going to bind myself to a life I don't choose in order to protect a dynasty I wasn't asked if I wanted. The room was as quiet as 600 people in a ballroom can get. Victoria Langley is a remarkable person, he said, and meant it. She deserves someone who chooses her for herself. This was never that. We both know it. He looked at his father last. I love you, he said, and the simplicity of it hit the room harder than everything else had. I have spent my entire life trying to be what you needed me to be. I can't do it anymore. Not like this. Nathaniel Ashford said nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds, which is a very long time when 600 people are holding their breath. Then Nathaniel spoke. You leave this room with her, he said, and his voice was controlled and final as a gavel. You leave without the Ashford name behind you. I mean that entirely. Ethan nodded. Once. As if he had already known and had come anyway. He looked at Clara. I'm sorry for what I put you in the middle of tonight. Don't be, she said. And she meant that, too. They left together. Not dramatically. Not with backward glances. They walked out through the Eastern Service corridor, past the linen cart and the kitchen sounds and all the invisible machinery of the evening, and out into the ordinary night air of Midtown Manhattan. What came after was not a fairy tale. It was just life, which is harder and more interesting. Nathaniel did exactly what he said he would do. Ethan's access to the Ashford accounts was terminated by morning. His apartment, owned by the company, required him to vacate within 30 days. His position in the company's international division was quietly eliminated. The Langley family released a terse statement about the end of a private personal matter, and Cornelius Langley did not return Nathaniel's calls for 6 weeks, which was, by the standards of that world, a devastating social verdict. Margot Osei managed the narrative with the precision of a surgeon, and the public story that emerged was this: a young heir had made a reckless personal decision that had embarrassed his family. It was a story that made Nathaniel look long-suffering and Ethan look foolish, and Clara look, when she was mentioned at all, like an opportunist in a black blazer. Clara went home that night to her apartment in Woodside, Queens, 3 rooms, a small kitchen, a window that looked out onto an elevated train line, and she sat with what had happened for a long time before she slept. She was not naive about what had just occurred. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had grown up watching the difference between how rich people lived and how the rest of the world did, that she had just stepped into the crosshairs of a very powerful man's anger. She knew what the Ashford name could do, deployed as a weapon in the kind of circles that made and unmade professional reputations. She was scared. She also knew something else, which she turned over carefully in the quiet of her apartment. What Ethan Ashford had done in that ballroom had cost him everything his father had built, and he had done it anyway, and he had done it without asking her to match the cost. That was not nothing. They met for coffee 4 days later, at a diner in Astoria, because she suggested it, and he came without argument, and that small fact, that he came to her neighborhood, no car, no assistant, looking like a man who had not been sleeping enough, told her more than the gala had. She asked him what he intended to do. He told her he had money of his own, not family money, but a decade of his own investment decisions, managed independently, because he had always understood somewhere deep in him that a plan you couldn't enact alone wasn't your plan. It was enough to live on. To start something. What kind of something? She asked. The international development work, he said. The actual work. Not the capital arm of it. The on-the-ground infrastructure partnerships I've been running for 3 years. She looked at him across a diner table and thought about a man who had spent 3 years inside a dynasty learning the work he actually cared about. You've been planning this, she said. Not this specifically. A pause. The leaving. Yes. She understood. She had read his shoulder shift correctly for 3 years. I didn't need you to set fire to that ballroom for me, she said. It was not an accusation. It was important. I know, he said. I did it because I needed to stop being what I wasn't. He looked at her directly. You're the reason I knew the difference. She let that sit. How? She said eventually. Because every time I walked into the house and you were there, he said, you treated me like a person. Not the Ashford heir. Not my father's succession plan. You just treated me like a person who lived in the house and had a preferred coffee temperature and forgot to eat lunch sometimes. He stopped. I didn't know how starved I was for that until I had it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the lowest bar I have ever heard described as love, Ethan. He laughed. Genuinely. It was the first time she had heard him laugh without the performance quality in it, and it changed the whole shape of his face. You're right, he said. I'm working on a better speech. She told him she wasn't interested in speeches. She told him she had a life built on her own 2 hands and she wasn't going to dismantle it for anyone. She told him that if something was going to develop between them, it was going to develop at the pace of something real, which was slow, which was probably much slower than he was used to. He said he understood. She told him she would believe that when she saw it. The thing that nobody in that ballroom knew, the thing that didn't surface for another 4 months, and when it did, it surfaced the way submerged things surface, slowly, then all at once, was about Clara's father. His name was Raymond Reyes. He had worked for Ashford Capital for 7 years in the late 90s, in the early infrastructure division, before the company had gotten large enough to need its current organizational structure. He was not a senior man. He was the kind of mid-level operational mind that large companies run on and rarely acknowledge, the person who actually understands how the pipes connect, as opposed to the people who are photographed standing in front of the building. Raymond Reyes had discovered, in the course of his work, that a series of contracts awarded to a subsidiary company in 1998 had been structured in a way that obscured the actual ownership of that subsidiary. The beneficial ownership, it turned out, ran through a chain of holding entities to a group of investors who were, at the time, also on the regulatory board overseeing approval of one of Ashford Capital's largest infrastructure projects. It was, plainly put, the kind of conflict of interest that could have ended the company in 1998. Possibly ended it with criminal charges. Raymond had brought it to the person above him, who had brought it to the person above him, who had made Raymond Reyes quietly redundant inside of 3 months, with a severance agreement that contained a very thorough non-disclosure clause, and who had then made the problem disappear in the kind of structural reorganization that large companies periodically undergo for reasons that are never fully explained. Raymond had kept his copy of the documentation. Not out of strategy, out of stubbornness. He was that kind of man. He put it in a box in a storage unit in Allentown and went on with his life, which had fewer good years in it after that than it had before. Clara had found the box after her father's death, 3 years before she took the job at the Ashford house. She had read every document in it with the careful attention of someone who had watched a quietly brilliant man be made small by a system he could not fight. She had taken the job, in part, because she wanted to understand whether what her father had documented was what it looked like. And in 3 years of being invisible in that house, in hearing the casual conversations about subsidiary structures and legacy agreements and the Foundation's use of certain infrastructure holdings, she had become very certain that it was exactly what it looked like. She had not done anything with this information. She had not come into the house with a plan. She was not a schemer. She was a woman who paid attention and who believed, as her mother had raised her to believe, that you do not act until you understand what you're acting on. She had been waiting to understand. The moment that changed the waiting happened in February. A journalist named Obi Trask, 28 years old, 3 years at a financial investigative outlet called the Meridian Wire, published a piece about a current infrastructure procurement process in which Ashford Capital was bidding on a federal communications contract. The piece raised questions about the ownership structure of one of the subcontractors involved. It was not a smoking gun. It was the kind of article that asks a question very precisely so that it cannot be ignored. Nathaniel's response, as managed by Mogo Osei, was swift and professional and denied everything. Obi Trask, Clara learned, was still asking the question. He had a source, apparently, but not a document. She knew where the documents were. She sat with this for 2 weeks. She thought about her father. She thought about a man in a storage unit in Allentown who had done the right thing and been made smaller for it. She thought about Ethan, who had walked across a ballroom and done the honest thing and been stripped of everything for it. She thought about the pattern. And then she called Obi Trask. What happened after that took 6 months and was not a tidy story. These things never are. What it involved: 3 investigative journalists, 2 legal firms, a federal regulatory review, a significant amount of time in which Clara's name appeared in ways that were designed to discredit her and did not succeed, because the documents were the documents and documents do not have reputations to ruin. What Nathaniel Ashford faced, in the end, was not criminal prosecution. He was not, personally, the man who had made the original decision in 1998. He was the man who had inherited a company with a buried problem, who had been told about it, who had allowed it to stay buried because unburying it was expensive and the company was at a critical growth moment. What he faced was the choice between fighting it and dismantling it. He chose to dismantle it. That decision, the disclosure, the restructuring, the return of certain contract awards, the cooperation with the regulatory review, cost the company 2 years of carefully managed crisis and approximately $240 million in remediated agreements and structural changes. And it saved the company. This was what Clara had seen in the documents that her father had not lived to see proven out: the underlying business was sound. The infrastructure was real. The value was genuine. The buried problem was not the whole company. It was a wound that had been allowed to fester because the men around it had been afraid of what the surgery would cost. The surgery was expensive. The patient lived. Nathaniel Ashford came to Queens in March. No assistant. No car service visible on the block, though Clara assumed there was one somewhere on the corner, because she understood who this man was. He stood outside the building that housed the small operational consulting firm she had started 6 months earlier with 3 staff members and a client roster that had, in the wake of the investigation becoming public, expanded significantly. He looked like a man who had slept poorly for an extended period. He looked like a man who had been wrong about something important and had finally, after the appropriate amount of difficulty, arrived at the acknowledgement of it. She let him in. They sat in her office, which was small and clean and had a window that looked out at a water tower, and she gave him coffee she made herself, and she let him say what he had come to say. He said it without preamble. Your father was right. And I am sorry he spent the last 20 years of his life carrying something that should have been corrected the moment he brought it forward. That was a wrong that was done in this company's name, and I cannot give him back what it cost him. Clara was quiet. You could have used what you had to destroy us, he said. You chose to give it to people who could correct it instead of people who would only use it to take us apart. I didn't do it for you, Clara said. I know. He looked at her steadily. You did it because you are your father's daughter, and your father believed the company was worth saving if it would do the right thing. He filed those documents away instead of burning them because part of him still believed that. I think you believed it too. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. My son, Nathaniel said, and something shifted in the composed face, something costly, made a better choice than I gave him credit for. Clara waited. Not about the gala. The gala was a disaster, and I imagine he would admit that freely. A pause. About you. He saw something I had been looking at for 3 years without the sense to see. With respect, Clara said, he would have preferred you to say that to him. I intend to, Nathaniel said. I came here first. She studied the man across the desk. The man who had said you leave this room without the Ashford name and had meant it, and had been wrong, and had the particular dignity that belongs to people who can be genuinely wrong and not die of it. I'll tell him you came, she said. And then, after a moment, he's had good coffee here, if you want to stay a little while. Nathaniel Ashford stayed a little while. There is a version of this story where Clara Reyes sweeps into a billionaire's life and remakes it and is rewarded with the fortune and the name and the whole polished architecture of the world that had previously excluded her. That is not quite what happened. What happened is that a woman who had spent her entire life reading rooms and protecting her own quiet dignity met a man who was brave enough to be seen for the first time in a very long time, and they built something together at the pace that real things are built, slowly, with difficulty, with the kind of honesty that is uncomfortable before it becomes the only thing you'd want. Ethan's firm, International Development Infrastructure, small scale, building connected partnerships in places that needed the pipes and the roads and the communications towers more than they needed another capital acquisition, grew into something his father's company eventually chose to work alongside. Not because Nathaniel required it, but because the business sense was undeniable and because Nathaniel Ashford had spent 61 years doing what the business sense required. Clara runs her own firm still, independently. The work expanded, as the work of people who are genuinely good at what they do tends to expand when the world has had a chance to look at them directly. They married on a Saturday in September. The ceremony was small. Her mother was there, and she cried, and it was the best thing in the room. Nathaniel was there, in the second row, and he held himself very straight and very still in the way of a man carrying something he was managing carefully. After the ceremony, Ethan found him standing by the catering table looking at a photograph of Clara and her mother that someone had set up near the entrance. "She told me you came to Queens," Ethan said. "I did. You could have called." "I know." Nathaniel looked at the photograph for another moment. Some things need to be said in person. Ethan stood beside his father and neither of them said anything for a while, which was, for them, new and also fine. "You saw her," Nathaniel said eventually. "Not an accusation. Something else." "She's very easy to see," Ethan said, "once you stop looking past her." Clara's mother, Soledad Reyes, asked her once, late in the evening of the wedding, the guests thinning out, her shoes off and a glass of wine on the table, what it was that had made her trust him. Ethan. The first time. Clara thought about it. "He washed his own dishes," she said. "In a house with 6 staff. Every Sunday morning. He didn't think anyone saw." Soledad looked at her daughter. "And what did that tell you?" "That he knew what invisible felt like," Clara said. "And he didn't want to make it worse for anyone else." Her mother nodded slowly. She understood that language. She had spoken it her entire life. "Your father," Soledad said, "would have liked him very much." Clara picked up her wine glass and looked out at the room, her evening, her people. "I know," she said. "That's how I knew. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight, before you go." There were 600 people in that ballroom the night Ethan Ashford crossed the floor. 600 people with money and names and influence and every kind of power the world trades in. And every one of them looked straight through the woman by the service corridor. The one person who actually looked at her had nothing left to lose by doing it, because he had already decided to let go of everything else. And the woman they looked through turned out to be the one person holding the document that could save the whole thing. That tends to be how it works. The person everyone is looking past is almost always paying the closest attention. And they almost always have been, for much longer than anyone knew. So here is what I want to know from you tonight. In your own life, at work, in your family, in the places you move through every day, who is the person everyone is looking past? And more importantly, when did they last know that you saw them? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, if you believe what I've come to believe, that the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to see them, then do me one small favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Drop a like so the next person can find their way here. And leave your story below. I'll see you in the very next one.